It is starting to record now.
Very good. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I believe this is Bastille Day. So, if we are French extraction, today's a very important day. The Tour de France is about halfway through, I think, if you follow that. Exciting news every day when you get home from work, or a video replay if you're so inclined. Always fun. So, today we are meeting the very first time to talk about this source course workshop. And some of you have done some work in a source course, so you know what's going on. But what we're going to do today is start the process. We'll do an overview, talk about what source course is and what it isn't. We will also talk a little bit about some of the things that we've learned along the way and any changes to the source course process. And then, of course, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. In a little bit, I'll start sharing my screen so we can take a look at the most important component, as I see it, or the foundational component of this, which is a course design rubric. But before we get there, let me just talk a little bit about source course overall. When I came here in 2015, and some of you may have been around at that time, Christy and Becky and so on, online courses were, especially online courses, and the use of Moodle at the time, JetNet, the LMS, were kind of off on their own. The institution didn't really think of itself as an online program offering institution. Instead, what was going on, as was not abnormal for the time, where there were a few programs that, for a variety of reasons, either a faculty member being inspired to do so or wanting to learn more about this new thing, online education, or having the sense that that was how they could reach the students that would be interested in the program, those people kind of set off on their own. They were pioneers and they developed online programs, online courses without the kind of institutional support that had been there originally. Many of you, or some of you may know, there was an online department years ago that kind of got dropped in a budgetary thing. And then those people kind of soldiered on all by themselves. The institution had kind of set online programs off on their own. The support was limited. Anyone who wanted to use the LMS could use it, but not everyone was. In fact, most people weren't using it. And then we started moving into, well, 2015 when I got here, more and more courses needed to be online to serve the students, and more people had online classes, so they were more comfortable teaching and developing online classes. But the support for it was not institutionalized. Instead, people were pretty much saying, I've got to design and build this course on my own. And in some cases, an adjunct was hired and they had to develop their own online class, sometimes as they were teaching it, which, if you've done that, is not a fun or useful thing to do. It's all you can do to keep up with an online class teaching it, let alone having to design and build it as you're teaching it. So when I got here, I started trying to provide more support for the development of online classes and started to promote the idea of those. Remember, we used to call them master courses, which was a course shell that was designed to be used over and over again, mostly to populate adjuncts sections so they wouldn't have to design it their own, but also to create that sandbox, a place where you could design a class that was not the actual class so that you could play around with things, you could reconfigure things, and then you would always have that copy. Moving into Canvas, especially, we wanted to make that even more institutionalized. So we started calling them source courses. It is the source for the courses that are actually in the production environment. And that's what this workshop kind of was designed to do, was to help do that. Now, what we saw going on was a source course is, in our vocabulary, kind of a specific thing. And that is, it is a course that is specifically designed to be taught by many people. And because of that, there are certain constraints that we put on it. So instead of designing a course just for yourself, it's very useful to think about this as a more generalized course, which is not designed for your personal preferences or strengths as an instructor, but rather to designed to be taught by anyone, many adjuncts who would be teaching the class. Also, we wanted to make sure that we were meeting our Americans with Disabilities commitments and the legal requirements, certainly. We wanted to make sure that we had good course quality because our primary concern is student success. And we know that by having a good design, we can improve student success. So that's what source course is. And what I argued with administration and actually got was this is a training to teach you how to develop source courses, but also how to help other people develop source courses. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be teaching you how to think in a design framework, but also how to use a course design rubric to guide your design and also to help you peer review other people's designs and have them peer review your designs. This rubric is heavily based on Quality Matters, which is higher education's kind of standard for online course development and quality review. This Quality Matters research resulted in a commercial program company called Quality Matters. Quite expensive to be a member of, but the research is free to anyone. So there are other people doing this, and Michigan Colleges Online many years ago developed their own take on this, the Michigan Colleges Online Course Quality Rubric, which aligns to HLC standards and is based in that same Quality Matters research from all those years ago. We ran a pilot for this and we improved this course design. We made it into a format that is easier to use. It's a spreadsheet now rather than a PDF. And we modified the components so that it met Jackson College's quality needs better than the original. And I would argue better than the Quality Matters current framework also. It's it is a course quality design quality rubric. It is not a course content rubric. So that's one of the most important distinctions that I want to make here. And that is source course, this workshop, we're not going to be subject matter experts in each other's subjects. So subject matter concerns, that's the department and the dean, whatever your department and your dean sees as the course content quality requirements, that's still in place and we don't change that at all. What this is about is the course shell in Canvas design quality. And it relies heavily on research about what is useful, good, and helpful for students to ensure student success. So we'll get to that in more depth a little bit later. What we're going to be doing in this workshop to support your learning how to use this rubric and learning how to design your class. And let me make one step back. Just because this is heavily designed, the rubric designed for online course shells, it is still generalizable and applicable to hybrid and even face-to-face classes that just use a course shell as a support. So it generalizes well. The online course shell is the most restrictive and most difficult. So then it's easy to generalize and move to those other kinds of course delivery options. I want to make sure that's clear. So what we'll be doing in this workshop, learning how to use this and learning how to design classes and learning how to do effective peer reviews of course shells, is we're going to have some of these synchronous online group meetings where we'll be talking about some of the components, talking about how to design well and how to do peer reviews. You're going to be doing a face-to-face preferred, but if need to be, it can be Teams or even some other synchronous online method. Consultation with Sonia and me. So you'll have that individual, or if you have a small group you want to work with, that's fine, but a consultation where we can talk about some of the things that are idiosyncratic or specific to your course in terms of design approaches, frameworks to use, and so on. You'll be doing an outcomes to assessment review of your course, and this helps ensure that the outcomes that are approved for your course are assessed at a high level. And it's sort of the intention that all courses, all sections of your course that teach to the same outcomes should use the same or substantially similar assessments to ensure that there is fairness across and also comparability across sections. Then you're going to be doing a self review of your course using the rubric that we're going to show you and teach you how to use self review. And then, of course, you'll be free to make modifications to that course based on what you find in that self review and what you find in your outcomes and assessment or outcomes to assessment review and what you learn in the face to face or online consultation with Sonia and myself. Once you've done that, you're then going to offer your course up to be peer reviewed by others in this workshop, and they will offer up their course to be peer reviewed. And that's how you're going to get practice peer reviewing, and you're going to get some support in that peer review. Then you will make modifications to your course that you see fit based on the peer review, and those others that you peer review for can make modifications on their courses. And let me state here that in general, Sonia and I aren't going to make you make any modifications. You are in charge of your class. We're here to provide a service. We may suggest very strongly that this is something that we really think you should do, but in the end, you own the class and you get to make the decisions about what you include, what you don't include, and so on. As we move towards the culmination of this course or this workshop, there will be an ADA check. We now have the tool Ally, which vastly simplifies meeting ADA requirements, and we'll teach you about that if you don't know how to use. And we'll do a check to make sure that you've satisfied that. And then you get paid $500, and that payment isn't for developing the course. That payment is for learning how to do course design and peer reviews using the MCO rubric. Before I get into that MCO rubric, I'd like to see if there are any questions or thoughts or concerns at this time that I should address. So opening it up to you. Christy, please.
I just wanted to know, so this will be based on one course, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, great, thanks.
Right. The idea being that once you do one course, then you can do any number of courses in your own time. I guess maybe I should mention the time frame, since this is the very last time that we're going to be doing this, we want these done by the 1st of December. So you have about 6 months to complete any work that you need to do in this redesign, which should be plenty of time, even if you decide not to start from a shell that you already have and you want to just redesign everything. 6 months should be enough time to do that. Any other questions? Becky.
So for all of the courses that we teach, is there a deadline as of today that all of these source courses need to be completed for all the classes of which we are leads?
There is not a hard deadline yet. There is a policy change to the distance learning policy that is in the discussion phase, which would say that all courses that are taught online would have to have this course review process done and the ADA review done. If that policy makes it through, as it looks like it will, then there will be a deadline, and that will be between you and your dean when that deadline is, or maybe they'll tell me when they want it and then I'll publicize it. But that deadline probably would not be, certainly wouldn't be the fall term, but it might be, say, I'd say the fall following would be kind of a reasonable expectation that everybody have all of the courses for which they are lead developed as a source course if they're going to be taught online. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much. Yep, it does. Thank you.
Great. And then what we found is, I'm thinking of Kristen Stockbridge, who I think maybe lead for more classes than anybody else at the institution. Once she took this, she kind of powered through, and in some cases, she had an adjunct hired to create a certain course for which she didn't have the expertise, even though she was still the lead. She's not really the content lead. She's the program lead, I guess you would say. So she was able to, I think she did like 9 or 10 in the next 6 months. She just powered through them. And once you learn how to do this, it does, I won't say it simplifies things, but it gives you a path through which you can develop a course, pretty effective course, pretty quickly. And I guess that also, I should talk about it. Just because you have a source code doesn't mean that you're done designing, right? Every time you teach a class, every time you get feedback from adjuncts who teach a class, you'll think, oh, here is a support that we're learning we need to help students be more successful. Or here's a change that we need to make to the assessments. And you will continue to do that. You will keep a copy of the source course. So Sonia and I, we make a master backup hidden away in a vault somewhere. So if you ever needed to go back to it, it would be there. And someday in the future, when I don't know, I thought we would start being there by now, but we're not. When IT gets some technological things figured out, which will connect Canvas to Colleague in a way that will identify what courses are taught by whom and so on, there's a tool in Canvas called blueprinting, which means that once they figure all of this out, it should be possible for course shell copies to be automated for these courses that we call blueprint courses. So that would be a source course that is not it's not an old course shell, it's not a sandbox shell. It's actually a shell in a special directory that is connected by these tools that IT is working on with the production versions of the shell. So as soon as a production version of a shell is created, all of those tools, as if by magic, will know, oh, that is a section that needs this empty blank master course or source course shell copied into it, and it will be done immediately. So you won't have to worry about it as the lead faculty, and Sonia and I won't have to do it. It will just be done, and that will be kind of a, I think, a step forward in one of the reasons why we went to Canvas. But we're not there yet. Just know that's kind of a future thinking that we're planning for. So that's another reason to do the source course. Any other questions? Sonia, can you keep track of the chat? If anyone asks a question in there, just jump in and ask it. That way I can keep managing the screens and things like that.
Yes, I am.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
All right, so before we jump into really what's the main thing here, and that is the rubric, I want to give you some of the lessons we've learned by doing source course. One of the first one is the teacher's guide or teaching guide or adjunct support guide. So this is a hidden file or several hidden files that we found are really helpful to put into a course, the source course shell. And these are designed to help an adjunct specifically, but can help anybody, teach the class more effectively. Things that we would perhaps include in that would be, remember to check your syllabus and the course due dates to make sure that they align. You know, that changes every term, so that has to be done. Make sure that you put your picture or a welcome video into whatever kind of welcome orientation to the course you've done, and so on. Some people have even gone so far as when they create a discussion forum or a synchronous session expectation, they provide some topics that they recommend that the person teaching the class touch on or build that session around. So you can use it to a great extent to help support other people's teaching of the course in a way that helps improve student grades and student success. Another thing that we want to recommend, we found that we need, is a weekly graded task for every course. And the reason for that is, number one, the easiest way to take attendance is to have something that is required, the student has to engage with in order to trigger the attendance tool. But also, it's an easy way for anyone to know if a student should be counted as attending or not, and potentially be candidate for dropping before census. If they're not engaging in this one required thing every week, then they're not attending an online class. The next thing that we've learned, a lesson learned, is make sure that you put due dates on everything. Even if you're not going to close out the access to that thing, you can create a due date and you can leave the assignment open, because we have a tool called Dropout Detective, which is really helping with the retention alerts and things like that. Well, Dropout Detective really needs to use the due date in order to know if a student is on your pacing guide. So in some cases, people like to have a course where you have a task that is not due until near the end of the term, but you have perhaps some intermediary activities which lead up to that. So even if you would allow a student to turn something in after the date you would actually like them to have it, we would call that a due date. You can leave it open and they can continue working on it. But if you put a due date on there, number one, it informs the student, hey, you should be doing this about now. And number two, it can help Dropout Detective determine with their algorithm which students are in danger of not succeeding in the class because they're not in that pacing guide. So that's another thing we've learned. Uh, a big thing that we've learned is a big help through doing this several times now is ensuring that outcomes and assessments are considered at the very first. So when we first started doing this, a common way to do a source course is just to import a course that you taught from that worked pretty well. And then once we started moving through this and looking at, what are the indicators of success and what's there and what's not there, some people, once they taught it one time, started to come to the realization and communicating this to us. What I found was I had a lot of things in my course that were process oriented that were impacting the grade too much. So in other words, they were grade items that were like attendance, participation grades, or small little checkpoints that when you really looked at the grading system, they were unduly influencing grade, the final grade, either positively or negatively. In other words, grade inflation, if there were too many of them, like a lot of homeworks that weren't accounted for, you could have more points in homework than in the major assessments, be that the tests or projects or a combination of those. So knowing that ahead of time helps you do the design on the front end rather on the back end. The other thing it did is some people, when they did this, they realized because of over time, you put things into a course because you find that, a certain class needed it and sometimes they don't, is that there was a little bit of bloat going on. They had things in the course that they were fun activities, they were tangentially related to the course outcomes, but they didn't really directly impact the course outcomes, the success, the attainment of course outcomes. So because of that, they weren't essential, but they were being graded as if they were essential and treated as if they're essential in terms of the amount of time and energy students spent on them. And then the other thing was that there are things that you needed to account for that weren't. So, for example, some people found I've got this outcome that I've never really assessed well until I really looked at my course and determined these are the outcomes. Here's how I'm going to assess them. We call this backwards design in the design thinking world. You start with your very end result, which is how can student what am I going to know? How will I know that I've taught what I've said I'm going to teach? Well, first you have to know what you teach, then you have to know how to measure it. Once you know how you're going to measure student success against those outcomes, you can build those assessments. And once you've got those assessments built, it's not teaching to the test, but what it is, it's then you ensure that you have material and engagement learning processes that are directly related to ensuring the students arrive at the outcome assessments ready to succeed in them. And when you do that, it simplifies design and it really improves design in the end. It improves what happens in the course. After your source course is all done, You will have a copy of it. You'll continue to be able to revise it. Sonia and I create that vault copy. If you change your course substantially, so after you get the source course done, it will be a sandbox version for you. You'll continue to put it into your adjuncts or your own empty course shells at the start of every term. But then obviously you make changes. Once you get to the point where you think, the changes I've made in this course are substantial, let us know, and we will replace our vault copy with the most updated version. And this is just a service to you to make sure that there's always a backup copy that we can get to, but also thinking ahead to when we have the blueprinting process involved. That vault version is the copy that will be placed into all of your adjuncts production level source courses or your course shells. Any questions now before I share my screen and show the MCO rubric that we're going to be talking about in the rest of this process? All right, so here we go. I'm going to turn off my screen or my camera because I'm going to start looking over this way and it will look like I'm ignoring you, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to turn off my camera and I'm going to share my screen. And what I'm going to be sharing is the MCO rubric that forms the, let me increase the size a little bit. There we go. Hopefully you'll be able to see that on screen, and you'll have your own copy. And if you've already looked at the course shell, you've seen a copy of it. So this rubric is, I wouldn't even say it's a slight modification. It's a pretty big modification of the MCO course rubric. We modified it just this last month, June, but we tend to review it and change it as needed. It follows these guidelines. So let's just start here. First guideline, overview and introduction, aligned to HLC guideline 4F at the time of this. I don't know if HLC has updated that, and we haven't checked that yet. And this is about course structure. Course structure is clear. Students are able to understand the organization. Next one, introductory statement to the student includes information, purposes, components, and how student learning is structured. The next one is the etiquette or netiquette, expectations about how we interact with each other. Instructor introduction, student's introduction, prerequisite learning stated, minimum tech skills of the student are clear. Now, what you're going to find as we go through these, some of these things are things that you design into the course shell. Others you've already got in your syllabus. And since your syllabus will be connected into your course shell, you can consider that as one of those components to check to find some of these kinds of things. The next one, this is guideline 1C for HLC, and these are all about outcomes. Course outcomes are clearly stated from the student's perspective. So what you'll find when you review your approved course outcomes, they're in education speak. They're not really stated in terms that are student-centered. So you may want to include in your syllabus or in the course a revision, not a revision, but a description or a redefinition of your course outcomes in a way that says, hey, student, by the time you finish this class, you will be able to do this, this, and this in a more friendly, approachable way, something that is in the language of the student, in the language of the discipline, and in the context that the student will understand it. Make sure your outcomes are measurable. Outcomes correlate with real world performance expectations. Outcomes at the module or the unit level are measurable and consistent with the course level outcomes, and outcomes are appropriate for the level of the class. That's something that probably you'll want to determine within your department. And you'll notice that our rubric uses yes, the reviewer sees it, it's apparent to them, not yet, meaning that they didn't understand this, or it is not something that they're fully comfortable with and they'll want to talk to you about it, or unable to verify. So something like this, outcomes appropriate for the level of the course. Now, a lot of times, an educated individual can look at the course and they can make some determinations. Yeah, that seems appropriate. But in some cases, some of the content outcomes are so discipline specific that someone who is not within that discipline may not feel comfortable saying, yes, that's appropriate to this course, in which case you say, unable to verify, meaning we're tossing it back to you as the subject matter expert and your department level review, however you do that, to make sure that that's the case.
Brian, before you
Yes.
move on from outcomes, could you
Yes.
speak a little bit between the difference of outcomes and objectives and how we're finding that they're being used interchangeably?
Very good point to make at this. Thank you, Sonia. So outcome is that big picture thing that the curriculum committee reviews and approves, and it says, yes, this outcome is appropriate for this. Outcomes are often not directly measurable. In other words, you can't have a single test item or a single project that says, yes, this student has met this outcome, because an outcome attempts to capture a fairly large chunk of performance, knowledge, skills, and sometimes even values or attitudes, and they're not always directly measurable. So then from there, people will develop objectives that are directly measurable. Now, some people think of outcomes and objectives as the same thing, and they could be if your outcomes are so specific that they are directly measurable. But a learning objective is something that is often extracted or built to combine with other learning objectives in order to attain an outcome. So for illustration purposes, I'm going to choose something very simple. Let's say that our outcome is that the student will be able to safely bake a cake in a well-equipped kitchen. So if you think about that, you might be able to say, I'm going to directly measure that by saying, did they survive, not burn the house down, and bake an edible cake? Okay, you could say that. But if you're actually going to teach the requisite components of that, first you'd say, well, let's deal with safety first, because that's really important. So then you might come up with 3 or 4 or 5. You might even come up with something that is more like an outcome that's all about safety, which it would be, the student will demonstrate safe kitchen practices. Underneath demonstrating safe kitchen practices, you're going to have things like the student will know how to dress appropriately for a kitchen environment. No open-toed shoes, uh, coverings, aprons, sleeves, the use of gloves, the PPE kinds of things that you would think of in science. When in the kitchen, you gloves, there would be sanitation objectives. All of those would be written to be measured directly. So hand washing is one. It's big in medicine, but it's also big in culinary, which is the student would demonstrate the knowledge and skill of proper hand washing. So, it's like 30 seconds, and there are certain things that you have to do in terms of, scrubbing and the amount of soap and all of that. You would write objectives that would directly measure that. The next thing, kitchen cleanliness. You might say, okay, the student is going to demonstrate understanding, knowledge, and the skill to properly clean food preparation surfaces and implements. So you would write objectives specific to those that would be directly measurable. The next thing is understanding the history of cakes and pastries, or whatever it is the thing is. So you would have knowledge objectives that would be directly measurable. Might be, like the 3 essential ingredients in a cake are, flour, eggs, leavening. I'm making this up. Obviously, I'm not in that, and I don't know that. But you would have objectives that were written to directly measure those components of that big outcome, being able to bake a cake. So that's the difference, as I see it, between outcome, big picture, and objective, which learning objectives need to be directly measured, and they tend to be things that you directly teach and directly assess at some level. Does that answer the question appropriately and satisfactorily, Sonia?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a very good distinction to make, because in education, we have all of these terms. Sometimes we use the same term, for example, objective, at the course level and at the lesson level, but they are not. A course level objective tends to be larger, and a lesson level objective that is directly measurable tends to be, very tight. And I know you guys have you've had workshops about writing those learning objectives, that it must be specific, it must be measurable, it has to state just one thing that the student will demonstrate and that sort of thing. That's the level of objective that I think of when I think of learning objective. All right, moving on.
Thank
The
you.
next
I
one
just see them
is,
interchanged like so often
yes,
that it's nice to hear it described in
yeah.
detail.
And that's, it's not essential. That's my instructional designer brain saying, you have to really be careful about the vocabulary you use because you're wanting something specific, and if you don't specify it, people who aren't within the design world might generalize and use the same term for multiple things. All right, so the next thing is the course design and instructional materials. First element is course materials support achievement of the stated course and module unit outcomes. So there's an alignment between the readings, the videos, and the other materials that are supposed to support the objectives or the module level outcomes that or the unit level outcomes that we were just talking about. Course materials incorporate a variety of ways for students to achieve the outcomes. And this comes from that whole body of research in the design tool called UDL, Universal Design for Learning, multiple ways of representing material to students, multiple ways of presenting material to students, multiple ways for students to represent and process information, and multiple ways for them to communicate to you about their learning. That's the UDL framework. Purpose of materials and how they're to be used, clearly explained. In an online class, so this is maybe a divergence, but you guys, most of you are experienced online instructors, so I know you know this. But since this video is being captured, I feel compelled to tell this little story, is that what we've learned in teaching online classes and designing online classes is that not only is it different for us, the instructors, it's different for students, and they perceive the difference. In an online class, which is different than a face-to-face class, students look for the pathway you've designed for them. So in a face-to-face class, students arrive to your classroom, they plonk themselves down in the chair, they set up their materials, and they kind of have this attitude of, within reason, I'm going to kind of just go with the flow here and do what everyone else is doing in the class. If we're all listening to the instructor, I've learned that I kind of have to at least fake like I'm listening to the instructor. If we have a small group, I at least have to make the instructor see me participating in here. If we're doing a little activity in class, I know I have to kind of engage. So we go with the flow. In an online class, maybe because that flow is harder to perceive, both as an instructor and a student, students look at, what is it that this course tells me I must do if I'm going to get a good grade? So they look for things that are graded. If it's not graded, they don't do it. They tend to ignore it. They also tend to look for shortcuts in an online class. What's the minimum I need to do in order to fool the instructor into thinking that I have passed this element? So when you're designing a class, you have to think about that, and you have to make more explicit what it is that you want students to do with the things there. You can't just put a link to the textbook and expect the students will read it. You have to assign readings. And then in an online class, especially, but also in a face-to-face class, you need to have some learning checks built in that carry some small points, but points to tell the student, not only do I assign this reading to you, but it matters to your grade that you actually read it by this date before we discuss it or before you have to use this information. So you have to really make sure that the purpose for putting something in the class is apparent to the student, and that's what that element is about. Next, presentation of content fosters active learning. Next, course instructions, assignment deadlines, and definitions are clear. Just was speaking about that. Navigation through the course is logical, consistent, and efficient. So you guys have probably heard about cognitive load. Cognitive load is a theory that says our brains and our processing ability is finite, it's limited. We can only process so much new information in a given amount of time. In an online class, it is possible that you are creating additional things that students have to learn over and above the content that you need them to learn. That would be things like, what do I need to click on? How do I use this presentation tool? How do I use this graphing calculator? Those additional components that they have to learn increases the load, the cognitive load, which decreases their ability to process the actual stuff that you're trying to teach them. So what we've learned and what research confirms is that if you create sort of a navigational flow that is consistent from module to module, then you reduce the cognitive load of learning what I need to do in this module or unit, and that increases the amount of cognitive space that students have to commit to learning the actual content. One of the ways that we found, not we, Sonia and I, but the field has found to do this is adopt a learning framework. One that I like and that I use in this class is Absorb, Do, Connect. Horton, back in the 90s or 2000s, wrote a book and included this framework. It's just a simple framework. First, you get students to absorb information. Sometimes we call this learn, right? You learn stuff, you read stuff, you watch some videos. Then to integrate that knowledge which you've observed, this information which you have absorbed, you really need to work with it. So you have a do component. You must do this. And then, because there's so much information and research on connecting information and knowledge to your experience or to your future predicted experience, a reflection piece or a piece that helps students explicitly connect what they have just done with either their lived experience or their desired job or their current job or some job that might be in the future, something that they may need to do in the future in another class. Like, you take in the medical field, you have to take the anatomy class. It's not just so you know anatomy. That's probably a worthwhile goal all by itself, but also because in the upcoming classes, you're going to have this memorized in order to succeed in those upcoming classes. That's a connection that you might want to make. So that sort of thing happens. All right. Next, interaction and learner engagement. So the set of components there, HLC guidelines 4G and 5C at the time of the development of this. Requirements for student interaction are clearly stated. So I like to think in design world, there are three types of interactions that you need to be concerned about. First, interaction between the student and the content. They're there to learn. So you have to make sure that you design that into your class. Next, interactions between the student and you or whoever the instructor is. That's essential. The instructor-student interaction is important in terms of instruction, but also in terms of being that model for someone who is passionate about the topic. That's a motivational thing. And also guidance. You help improve their performance through those interactions. It's required, and it's really an important thing to design purposefully into your course. The third type of interaction is interaction between students, student-to-student interaction. And that type of interaction has different purposes. Sometimes it's for practice. Sometimes in the do, you have a discussion that helps students to exercise their new vocabulary that they're adopting, or to begin testing their ideas along with other learners with you as oversight. In some cases, the interaction between students is motivational, it's, sharing of the experience. And in some cases, you can increase this where you need it or decrease it where you need it to manage cognitive load. And I think of those three types of interactions as being most important is content, second most important instructor, third most important is other students in most cases. Another researcher postulated that there was really a fourth interaction, and that is interaction between the student and the learning environments, this computerized learning thing. And that gets back to making sure that you use a consistent pattern so that it's discoverable and understandable how to engage with the learning. All right, next guideline is about assessment. Assessment methods appropriately measure stated outcomes. Now, again, this whole process, it's not about content, it's about design. So when you're reviewing someone's class and when they're reviewing your class, you're reviewing it not as a content expert, but as an expert in design. So the level at which you're looking at the assessment methods are, yeah, that makes sense to me as an educated human being. Not, yes, that makes sense to me as someone who is a content expert also. Does that make sense? You don't want to think that you have to review someone's assessments like, oh yes, Abraham Lincoln really did say this and meant this when he was doing this during the Civil War. It's not that level. It's like, this assessment is about Abraham Lincoln's role in the Civil War. Oh, there's some questions about Abraham Lincoln. Sounds good to me. Now, if you see some questions in a Civil War about John Kennedy, you might say, okay, I know there's some weird connections between Kennedy and Lincoln, but does that really meet? And you can ask that question, that sort of thing. Course grading policy and procedures stated clearly. If there is one area that causes the most student grievances and the most headache about student grievances, it's about the course grading policy not aligning with how the course is actually graded. So that's something that you're going to want to check. But also, there is wiggle room for interpretation. So you want to make sure that the policy is clear, procedures are clear, and that those align with the grade book that students will be interacting with. Assessment methods.
I want to say we have about 9 minutes left in this meeting. This meeting normally does go a little bit over while we're going through the rubrics. And if anybody does have a hard stop at 11, this is being recorded. Also, if you guys have any questions, please throw them in the chat. And if you guys want to hang out for a little bit longer while we complete the rubric, that would be nice too.
And what Sonia kindly didn't say is Brian talks a lot. And I apologize for that. I'll try to talk less in future. All right, so back to assessments. The methods provide varied and appropriate ways for students to demonstrate achievement of outcomes. Specific and descriptive criteria provided for the evaluation of student work, things like rubrics. And students have the opportunities to measure their own progress. Formative assessment is what that is about. All right, next one, course technologies and learner support. Tools and media support course outcomes. Course instructions articulate or link to technical support options, solution center, or to publisher resource, tech support, and so on. Academic support options, those are built into our courses, but you want to make sure that they're there. And course materials of all types are accessible following the current Jackson College guidelines. All right, next, hidden support files. So I mentioned this early on. These are the suggestions that we've learned, lessons learned over time, to put into that hidden file for other teachers. Prompt add introductory video or image to a welcome message. Align course item due dates with the syllabus. Information about any specialized, like publisher resources and things like that. Software is included. Interaction suggestions for students, Big Blue Button, Zoom, Teams. How are you going to interact with them? Let them know. Aspects of the class that are critical. These assignments must be done versus those that are optional. Optional, identify aspects of the class that the instructor might personalize. So in some cases, when you're designing a class in a discipline, you might say, here is our outcome, but it is separated from the topic. The topic is a method for getting there. So like in design, for example, Chrissy, you may have, the student has to learn this tool in Photoshop, but it doesn't matter which pathway or which topic that they undertake there. But you might include some topics that have been proven useful or some subjects that have been proven useful for getting students to that method. In history, it might be that logistics and war is an important object or outcome in the course, but it doesn't matter which war. So you might, as a history buff, you might say, okay, look, you can cover any war that's in the 20th century, and that you can study logistics and understand it from that standpoint. So you can put those kinds of personalization options in your class if you want to design those and give adjuncts the flexibility to exercise their discipline-specific expertise. Boilerplate languages for notices, topics for synchronous sessions, and so on are welcomed by a lot of people. Guidelines and procedures for dropping students. This is really important. We've got to make sure that we are clear about that, but also consistent. So putting that kind of expectation is useful. and guidelines and procedures for final grading, including how students need to do to get an incomplete grade, how much of the class do they need to have complete, and so on, and then the guidelines for that. Now we get into the final section, which is new this term. And this is something I'm going to turn over to Sonia, because Sonia, one of the reasons we hired Sonia is because she has a passion and some expertise in the inclusion area. So this is something that we turn over to her. So I'm going to ask her, Sonia, would you explain each of these and tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. I'd love to explain that these 4 bullets, they've been around. When I first came into Jackson College, I noticed that they were there in the critique or the suggestions that Brian had created, but they had never been approved to be in this rubric. And Brian and I have worked really hard to make sure that these are understandable for everyone. But the underlying what's not said in this is to intentionally provide a positive experience in your course community. And with that being said, it's not saying diversity, incorporate varied perspectives, examples, and references to represent diverse cultures, backgrounds, and experiences. It's not saying to go in there and make sure that everybody's represented as a checklist. But what it's trying to say is to normally have a practice of being aware and including everyone. And eventually, I mean, if you weren't already practicing that, eventually it just should become natural, and it's no longer a bullet for you. It's just something you do. That's kind of hard to explain, but it is a very intentional act until you get to the point of doing it on a regular basis without having to be intentional. Equity would be the accessibility, and we use the tool Ally in order to check it, but creating things in an accessible way, also trying to do it intentionally and using tools to support you and double check and make sure that you're doing them. But once again, doing them on a regular basis and then using the tool to back you up just to double check. But having that discipline to do it and not relying on a tool is what we're trying to add here in the rubric. And that leads us to belonging and making sure that students feel included. And there are studies on retention and motivation being directly related to if someone feels that they belong, especially in higher ed. And then there's inclusion and using inclusive language that avoids biases, stereotypes, and exclusionary terms, and creating a welcoming and respectful term or learning environment. So what I've suggested many times is I might see an instructor use she throughout the course or he throughout the course. I've even seen some marketing materials that have used genders or cultures, and I've suggested that we use they, them, or their instead. Now, if it's a story and you're trying to create an image of a specific surrounding in, an atmosphere in your writing, that might be a little different. But in your course material, especially removing non-politically correct stuff, like we should be past all of that already. But during this peer review, it gives somebody, the chance to take another look at your course and make sure that that's not done. So, or that it's done correctly, that it's not done incorrectly, and can help you change your perspective on how you write your course materials. Does that help, Brian?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very
Anything
much.
I'm missing?
When Sonia says she and I worked very hard on this, no, she did all of the work on this. And I was happy to turn it over to her because, like I said, one of the reasons we hired her was her passion for this, and it shows through. She'll be standing by to help anyone who wants some help in making sure that these elements are incorporated in their course design. All right, as we're wrapping up, I do want to point out this is the rubric that you will use to review your own course and then review other people's courses and have them review yours. So just the structure of it, those elements which we've gone through, notice that where is this found is the very first item. This can be used in two ways. One, if you like to use the model that we often use for our cooperative visits in the classrooms, you have a pre-review meeting. And you might go through this and talk about, okay, I'm going to review your class. Where do you think I'm going to find course prerequisites, for example? And someone will tell you, oh, those are stated in the syllabus. So you just write syllabus there. Then when you go through the thing, it can speed up your review a little bit if you know where to look. Or in some cases, you may say, I found this not in the syllabus. I found this in the very first introduction, or I found this in the instructions to a particular module or something like that. So you can state where you find something, or you can be guided to it. Either way works. A combination works also. Yes, it was clear. Not yet, meaning you kind of think it was there, but you want to ask them about it in the post-review debrief meeting. And here, unable to verify, typically that means I didn't see this at all, and I'm not sure it's there, or this is something I don't really feel confident in my ability to clearly find. So again, this is something you might ask about, or in your post-review, you might say, hey, check with your dean to make sure that you've covered this element. So that would be there. And then there's a column here for your notes, comments, and feedback. Two ways we use this. One, as a reviewer, you might have a great helpful suggestion. Like, hey, in my class, I found that this works. The other way we use this column is when you receive the review on your class and you go through it with the reviewer, use this column to write notes to yourself for things that you want to change. Once you're done with that, we're asking you to upload the version that you type in your comments, your thoughts on what you're going to change, or even what you did change. Type it into here and upload that as your documentation of having completed that step in the process. Speaking of which, let's finish up with looking at the class.
I want to mention it is
Yes.
11:02 for those who do have a hard stop at 11. Enjoy the weekend. See you next week. Same place, same time, same link.
Very good. Thank you. So this is the course shell. You've already seen it. We're doing the meeting topics for the first meeting. I didn't even publish that because that's kind of my note. But here you have a resource. What is the source course? It gives you some background and information on it. Here is your very first copy of the MCO rubric that we've just gone through. So those are the resources. This is what you're learning. And now it's time to do some things. Very first thing we want you to do is outcome to assessment. So there is an Excel sheet right here. You will want to download that. And that's weird. Download it. So this is going to ask you to look at the course outcomes that have been approved for your course and articulate them to essential assessment and any formative assessments. And there's an example. Here's a course outcome. Be able to explain technological determinism. How we're going to assess that is through a final exam. That's the essential assessment. And there may be more than one essential assessment, include them all. Here is a formative assessment. We ask the students to write a party sentence, which is an assignment with a discussion. So this is how students are going to know that they're making successful progress towards that. It's very simple. List each outcome, list every essential assessment and every formative assessment. What's the difference between an essential assessment and a formative assessment? An essential assessment is that which you and the programs that use your course say, this measures whether or not the student has achieved the course outcome. These are things that typically the formative or the essential assessments will be bigger points. They make more difference in the grade. A formative assessment can be a process-oriented assessment, meaning very few points. It is a assessment that helps students know that they're making progress. An example might be, we use a 10-item quiz at the end of every assigned reading. This checks to make sure that students are comprehending what they are reading and gives us an opportunity to make sure that they're really engaging with that. So that would be an example of a formative assessment. So we're going to ask you to do that. Once you do that, let me get back to my course. Once you do that, you will upload your spreadsheet to this assignment. So you'll upload an XLS or an XLS file, and then Sonia and I will be able to review that. Next, the second thing you're going to do is this assignment, which is to complete a review of your course with the instructional design team. So you will schedule a meeting with Sonia and myself, or one of us, at least one of us. We like to both be there, but if one of us can't make it, that's fine. And that meeting, we prefer face-to-face in the sandbox because we like to write on whiteboards. But if you can't make that work, we can meet via a synchronous tool. And what we're going to be doing is just how we're going to help you plan for creating a source course. That will include things like we know some tricks to help you clear out unused files from a shell. If you're using a shell that is a previously taught shell, there may be some files in there that aren't used that will count against you in your accessibility review. Makes sense just to create a clean copy to start your source course development in. Or you may say, hey, after doing that assessment to outcome review, I really wanted to start fresh. Start with an empty shell. We'll help you make that shell and get you started in copying anything over that you do want copied over, if it's just parts and pieces of a class rather than the entire thing. We'll talk to you about your assessment to outcome review, maybe have some thoughts about there, and then we can talk about making the shell teachable to any instructor. So set up that appointment. We would like to have that in the next week if possible. All right, and then the third thing you're going to do is, there are only two things to do. I took it easy on you. And then we have this end of module thing. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this about your classes, but there's these next things. A student, if you don't put end of module or something like that, they click next, and instead of seeing end of module, what they would see is the very next thing that they could do. So we find that if you put end of module at the end of your module, students know, oh, I just got done with this week's work. I don't have to jump ahead to the next week. It's just a little design trick that we found helpful in Canvas because of that next and previous button. All right, with that, I'm going to say that I am done sharing my screen, so I can turn my camera back on, stop sharing. And now's the part where we'll just take any questions that you have about this kind of thing, and then we'll turn off the recording and we'll answer any question that you might want to know, like, what are tonight's winning lottery numbers or meaning of life. But we won't share that on the video. So any questions about what we've talked about or source course overall that would be useful? Kim, you have something?
I do. And maybe I missed it because there's like 10 miles on 94 where I have no reception.
Yes.
Are we also supposed to be looking at the future and how this will work with CBE, or is that totally something else at this
Totally
point?
something else. So
Okay,
CBE
thank you.
design, CBE design you could think of is informed by this, but CBE design will likely have its own design constraints, which we will not deal with in this source course.
Okay.
So you can
And
think
then
about
my
it.
other,
You could think
That would
about
be
it
the
if you want
next
to, but it's not required.
that would be the next step.
that's what
Yeah,
I'm
that's another way.
thinking. The other thing, because a lot of the classes that I teach are both like hybrid, online, in the prison, in person, 3 week, 5 week, it's like
Yes.
insanity. W- Should you do a source course for
Each
each
format.
or each, like a 3 week, a 5 week? I guess I'm trying to lighten the load, but
Right. So
yeah.
it depends on the class and other factors. So here is an example. In terms of the structure of how many weeks a class is, what we typically recommend, if the format is the same, in other words, it is a online class, but it might be offered in a 12-week, a 7-week, a 3-week, a 1-week, that you design it so that it's flexible with a simple change. So the way you do that is, instead of designing by week, you design by outcome. And then that outcome in a 16-week class, outcome 1 might take 3 weeks. Whereas in a 7-week class, you might cover 1 outcome per week of the calendar. And the only thing you have to change there is the syllabus, the due dates, rather than the whole structure of the class. That class accordions. It will fill the entire semester, the full 16-week, or it can easily accordion down, and the same content, same assessments can be done in a shorter period of time with more intense work, of course. So that's one way to deal with that.
Okay.
Online
I
class and a face-to-face class are quite different. So I would say you
Yes.
probably need another source course for that. A face-to-face class in the prison is quite different than a face-to-face class on campus. Again, you might need to create a different source course. So what I would recommend is create the online version first. That
Okay.
online version tends to be the one that is more resource heavy, which you can then draw resources from into any of the other versions a little more easily than building up from the other versions to the online. Good question.
Thanks.
Anybody else with a question about source course, the process, how we're going to get through this, and so on? Matt asked about everyone should have access to the source course, and I see Sonia resent the invitation. Very good. All right, well, hearing or seeing no other questions, Sonia, if you would stop the recording. Matt, it should come as an invitation in your email. Let me check to make sure you are listed as a student in the class. Now, Matt, when on your, so I'm going to share my screen again. Sonia, you can turn off recording if you haven't already done so. So, Matt, what you might need to do is you might need to go to your courses menu item in Canvas,